He came for a promo, but when Jimmy Fallon mocked his past, Sylvester Stallone dropped the smile and dropped the room into stunned silence. Welcome to Stallone Unleashed. Let's uncover what really happened. The green room hummed with a forced, brutal gaiety, a stark contrast to the quiet landscape of his own thoughts. He sat on a plush, modern sofa that felt designed more for appearance than comfort, a cup of lukewarm tea, untouched, on the low table before him. He wasn't a man for green rooms, nor for the performative camaraderie they often engendered. His name, a household word for decades, now felt like a borrowed coat, one he wore with a certain weary obligation, but which never quite fit the contours of the man he had become. Around him, the usual pre-show ballet unfolded, publicists whispering into phones, makeup artists dabbing at faces already sculpted for the cameras, fellow guests exchanging air kisses and practiced anecdotes. He observed it all with a familiar detachment, his eyes, which had seen too much of the world's artifice and its raw, unvarnished truths, missing nothing. In his pocket, his fingers traced the worn edges of a small, folded piece of paper. Not a script, not notes for the interview, but a child's drawing, rendered in crayon with fierce, untutored energy. A stick-figure superhero, a lopsided sun, a dog with too many legs. It was a gift from his youngest grandchild, a grounding talisman in this world of fleeting fame and manufactured personas. He was here, on this late-night talk show, not out of any personal desire for the spotlight, but as a reluctant duty, a contractual obligation tied to a recent project. He knew the routine, the anodyne questions, the expected witty retorts, the carefully curated anecdotes designed to entertain, to amuse, to sell. He played the game, when necessary, with a professional grace, but a part of him always remained aloof, an observer in his own life. The host, a man whose relentless cheerfulness often seemed to border on the manic, was known for his playful, sometimes irreverent, interview style. He thrived on spontaneity, on catching his guests off guard, on creating those viral moments that fueled the relentless churn of the entertainment news cycle. He had been warned, by his own team, to be prepared for anything, to keep it light, to play along. But playing along had become increasingly difficult for him over the years. The carefully constructed facade of the action hero, the man of few words and fewer vulnerabilities, felt increasingly constricting. There were truths he carried, weights he bore, that didn't fit neatly into the pre-packaged narratives of celebrity culture. The piece of paper in his pocket, with its innocent, heartfelt depiction of heroism, was a reminder of a different kind of strength, a different kind of truth. He heard his name called, the summons to the brightly lit stage, to the roar of the studio audience. He rose slowly, his movements deliberate, the years of physical discipline still evident in his bearing, but overlaid now with a certain weariness, a hint of the battles fought not on screen, but within. He tucked the crayon, drawing more securely into his pocket. It was his shield, his secret, his connection to something real in a world that often felt profoundly, disturbingly unreal. He knew what was expected of him. He knew the role he was supposed to play. But tonight, for reasons he couldn't quite articulate even to himself, he felt a subtle stirring of resistance, a quiet refusal to simply go through the motions. The weight of his past, the sum of his experiences, felt more present, more insistent than usual. And he wondered, as he walked towards the lights, what would happen if, just for once, he chose not to play the game, but to speak a different kind of truth. The applause was a physical wave, washing over him as he stepped onto the brightly lit stage. He managed a small, almost imperceptible nod to the cheering crowd, his face a mask of practiced neutrality. The host, Jimmy, bounded towards him, all teeth and kinetic energy, his hand outstretched for the obligatory hearty shake. He's a legend, folks. A true icon. Give it up for the one, the only. The introduction, effusive and a little too loud, faded into the general din. He took his seat on the plush interview couch, the lights hot, the gaze of 1,000 unseen eyes of familiar pressure. Jimmy, already launched into his opening monologue of rapid-fire jokes and exaggerated gestures, seemed to vibrate with an almost frantic energy. He watched him, this man whose life was a performance, whose currency was laughter, however manufactured. He wondered what lay beneath the relentless cheerfulness, the carefully crafted persona. Was there a quiet space in him, a place where the laughter stopped and the silence began? Or was the performance all there was? The initial questions were as expected. Anodyne inquiries about his latest project, a few gentle teases about his iconic roles, an invitation to share a humorous, behind-the-scenes anecdote. He responded with his usual economy of words, his voice a low rumble that contrasted sharply with Jimmy's high-pitched enthusiasm. He offered a few carefully chosen, pre-approved stories, the kind that had been polished by years of retelling, safe, amusing, and utterly devoid of any real personal revelation. He could feel Jimmy trying to draw him out, to find a chink in the armor, to provoke a more spontaneous, more entertaining response. It was a familiar dance, one he had performed countless times. But tonight, the steps felt a little more forced, the rhythm a little more jarring. The crayon drawing in his pocket felt like a small, insistent weight, a reminder of a different kind of authenticity. Jimmy, sensing his guest's reserve, ramped up his efforts, his questions becoming more playful, more pointed, bordering on the irreverent. He brought up an old, slightly embarrassing clip from an early film, a moment of youthful awkwardness that had, inevitably, become a recurring internet meme. The studio audience roared with laughter. Jimmy, sensing a comedic bullseye, pressed on. "Come on, you gotta admit," Jimmy chuckled, wiping a tear of manufactured mirth from his eye. That was something else. Did you ever think, back then, that you'd become you?" He gestured expansively, encompassing the entirety of his guest's legendary career. He felt a familiar tightening in his chest, a subtle prickle of annoyance. He had endured this kind of gentle mockery countless times, had learned to smile, to play along, to offer a self-deprecating quip. It was part of the game, the price of fame. But tonight, the laughter felt a little too loud, the joke a little too cheap. He thought of the sacrifices, the discipline, the relentless hard work that had gone into building that career, the moments of doubt, of fear, of profound personal costs that were never seen, never acknowledged in these glib, superficial exchanges. He looked at Jimmy, at his beaming, expectant face, and for a moment he saw not a harmless entertainer, but a symbol of a culture that too often valued mockery over respect, sensation over substance. The decision was made in an instant, a quiet, internal shift. He would not play along. Not this time. He would not offer the expected, self-deprecating remark. He would, instead, offer something else. Something true. His expression, which had been carefully neutral, hardened almost imperceptibly. The hint of a smile vanished from his lips. His eyes, which had seemed distant, now focused on Jimmy with a new, unsettling intensity. The air in the studio, which had been crackling with manufactured mirth, suddenly grew still. Even Jimmy seemed to sense the shift, his smile faltering, his ebullient energy momentarily checked. The game had changed, and he, the reluctant guest, was about to rewrite the rules. He let the silence stretch, a deliberate, calculated pause that drew the attention of everyone in the studio, on stage and off. The laughter from the audience died down, replaced by a murmur of confused anticipation. Jimmy's smile had completely vanished now, replaced by a look of dawning unease. He fidgeted with his note cards, his usual unflappable composure visibly rattled. "That's something else," he began, his voice low, measured, but carrying a new, steely edge that cut through the studio's artificial cheer, was the result of years of relentless effort, Jimmy. Years of sacrifice. Years of pushing myself beyond what I thought was possible, often at great personal cost. He wasn't speaking loudly, but his words commanded attention, their quiet intensity a stark contrast to the preceding levity. He saw a flicker of surprise, then something akin to alarm, in Jimmy's eyes. This was not in the script. This was not the expected, playful banter. "It's easy to sit here now," he continued, his gaze unwavering, to look back at old clips, at youthful missteps, and to find them amusing. It's easy to reduce a lifetime of work, of struggle, to a 2-minute viral video. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. But what you don't see, Jimmy, what this audience doesn't see, are the countless hours of training, the injuries, the doubts, the moments when I wanted to quit but didn't. You don't see the toll it takes on your family, on your personal life, to dedicate yourself so completely to a demanding craft, to a public persona that often bears little resemblance to the man underneath. The studio was now utterly silent. Even the usually restless crew seemed frozen, their attention riveted on the unexpected turn of events. He could feel the tension in the air, a palpable force. He knew he was breaking the unwritten rules of the late-night talk show, a format built on superficial charm and carefully managed controversy. But he didn't care. He had reached a point where the truth, his truth, mattered more than the game. So, yes, he said, his voice softening slightly, but losing none of its intensity, that old clip might seem funny to you now. But for me, it's a reminder of a journey. A long, arduous journey. And frankly, Jimmy, I find your attempt to trivialize it, to reduce it to a cheap laugh, rather disappointing. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The quiet power of his rebuke was far more effective than any shouted accusation. He saw Jimmy swallow hard, his face pale. The usually quick-witted host seemed, for once, utterly at a loss for words. The carefully constructed artifice of the show had been pierced, and something raw, something undeniably real, had broken through. The crayon drawing in his pocket felt like a silent affirmation. He was speaking not just for himself, but for every artist, every craftsman, every individual who had ever poured their heart and soul into their work, only to see it misunderstood, or worse, dismissed with a casual, unthinking laugh. The legend had finally spoken, and his words, though quiet, resonated with the undeniable force of truth. Jimmy stared at him, his mouth slightly agape, the usually glib host rendered momentarily speechless. The studio audience was a sea of stunned faces, the earlier laughter replaced by a shocked, almost reverent silence. Even the house band, usually quick with a musical interlude to smooth over any awkwardness, remained silent, their instruments untouched. He let his words hang in the air, allowing their full impact to register. He had not come here to pick a fight, but he would not stand by and allow his life's work, the sum of his struggles and his triumphs, to be treated as fodder for cheap entertainment. He saw a flicker of something in Jimmy's eyes. Not anger, not yet, but a dawning comprehension, perhaps even a sliver of shame. The host, so accustomed to controlling the narrative, to guiding the conversation with his practiced charm, was now clearly out of his depth. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, as if unsure what to say, how to respond to such an unexpected, unvarnished display of honesty. I didn't mean to trivialize anything. Jimmy finally managed, his voice uncharacteristically subdued, a stark contrast to his usual ebullient delivery. It was just a bit of fun, no offense intended. He spoke the words, but they lacked conviction. They sounded like a reflexive attempt at damage control, a retreat to the familiar script of celebrity apology. He met Jimmy's gaze, his own expression unyielding. "Intentions, Jimmy," he said, his voice still quiet but firm, "are often irrelevant when measured against the impact of our words, our actions." He paused, then continued, "You have a powerful platform here, a platform that reaches millions. With that platform comes a responsibility to treat your guests, their work, their lives, with a certain measure of respect. Not just as props for your comedic bits, but as individuals who have their own stories, their own struggles, their own hard-won dignities." He leaned forward slightly, his intensity palpable. This business, the entertainment business, it can be a shallow and often cruel place. It chews people up and spits them out. It celebrates youth and novelty, and too often discards experience and wisdom. It thrives on sensation, on the fleeting viral moment, and it has little patience for depth, for nuance, for the quiet truths that lie beneath the surface. He wasn't just speaking to Jimmy now. He was speaking to the audience, to the industry, to a culture that seemed increasingly enamored with the superficial, the ephemeral. He was speaking from a place of deep, personal experience, from a lifetime spent navigating the treacherous currents of fame and public expectation. The crayon drawing in his pocket felt like a small, solid anchor in the swirling chaos of the moment. It represented a different set of values, a different kind of heroism, the quiet heroism of integrity, of authenticity, of staying true to oneself in a world that constantly tried to reshape you, to remold you into something more palatable, more marketable. Jimmy looked down at his desk, at his now useless note cards. He seemed to be genuinely struggling, the usual artifice stripped away, revealing a vulnerability that was almost disarming. The silence in the studio was no longer just shocked. It was contemplative, as if everyone present was being forced to reevaluate their own assumptions, their own complicity in a culture of casual disrespect. The legend had not just spoken, he had challenged. And the challenge resonated far beyond the brightly lit confines of the television studio. The weight of the moment was undeniable. Jimmy, for perhaps the first time in his highly successful career, looked utterly and completely outmaneuvered, not by a clever quip or a well-rehearsed anecdote, but by the sheer, unadorned force of authentic emotion. He fumbled with his pen, tapped his fingers on the desk, his usual repertoire of affable gestures now seeming awkward, inadequate. The audience remained hushed, a collective intake of breath hanging in the air. Even the producers in the control room, usually quick to cut to a commercial or steer the conversation back to safer ground, seemed to be holding back, recognizing, perhaps, that they were witnessing something rare and significant, a moment of unscripted truth that transcended the usual boundaries of late-night entertainment. He watched Jimmy, not with anger, but with a kind of weary understanding. He knew the pressures of the industry, the relentless demand for content, for ratings for the next viral sensation. He knew how easy it was to get caught up in the game, to lose sight of what truly mattered. But he also knew that there were lines, boundaries of respect and decency, that should not be crossed, even in the pursuit of laughter. "You know, Jimmy," he said, his voice softening slightly, though losing none of its underlying firmness, "laughter is a powerful thing. It can heal, it can unite, it can bring joy, but can also wound. It can diminish. It can be used as a weapon to belittle, to dismiss. And when it's used in that way, when it comes at the expense of someone's dignity, someone's hard-earned respect, then it ceases to be a source of joy and becomes something uglier." He paused, letting his words resonate. "I've spent a lifetime in front of cameras, playing characters, telling stories. I understand the nature of performance. I understand the need to entertain. But there's a difference between entertainment and exploitation. There's a difference between playful banter and a casual, unthinking disregard for another person's feelings, another person's life's work." He saw a flicker of something in Jimmy's eyes, a dawning comprehension, perhaps even a genuine remorse. The host, stripped of his usual comedic armor, looked surprisingly young, vulnerable. I think," Jimmy began, his voice hesitant, "I think I owe you an apology." He looked directly at him then, his gaze for the first time holding a measure of sincere contrition. I was out of line. I was insensitive. I got caught up in the moment in trying to get a laugh, and I crossed the line. I didn't mean to disrespect you or your career. I genuinely admire what you've accomplished, and I am truly sorry." The apology, when it came, felt unforced, genuine. It was not the glib, reflexive apology of a celebrity caught in a public misstep, but the heartfelt admission of a man who realized he had made a mistake, a significant one. He considered Jimmy's words, his apology. He saw the effort it cost him, the raw honesty in his eyes. He had not come here seeking an apology, but he recognized its significance. It was a small crack in the facade of a culture that too often prioritized laughter over respect, sensation over substance. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Apology accepted, Jimmy," he said, his voice quiet. But perhaps the more important apology is the one you owe to yourself and to your audience. An apology for underestimating their capacity for something more than cheap laughs. An apology for not trusting that they, too, might appreciate a moment of genuine human connection, of unvarnished truth, even on a late-night talk show. The words were not a rebuke, but an invitation. An invitation to aim higher, to dig deeper, to use the powerful platform he commanded not just to entertain, but also, perhaps, to elevate, to inspire, to foster a greater sense of empathy and understanding. The choice, as always, was his. The studio remained in a state of suspended animation. Jimmy's apology, and his guests' measured response, had shifted the atmosphere from tense confrontation to a more reflective, almost somber mood. The bright lights of the set suddenly seemed too harsh, the colorful backdrop too garish for the gravity of the conversation that had just unfolded. Jimmy sat quietly for a moment, absorbing the weight of his guests' words. The usual quick-witted host seemed to be engaged in a rare moment of genuine introspection. The note cards on his desk lay untouched, a testament to the unscripted nature of what had just transpired. "You're right," Jimmy said finally, his voice subdued, his gaze fixed on his hands, which were clasped tightly on the desk before him. "You're absolutely right. I do get caught up in the machine of it all. The need to be funny, to be entertaining, to keep the energy up. And sometimes I lose sight of the human element." He looked up then, his eyes holding a newfound sincerity, a vulnerability that was almost startling in its rawness. "It's a wake-up call," he admitted, "a much-needed one, and I appreciate you giving it to me, even if it was uncomfortable." He managed a small, wry smile, the first genuine, unforced smile he had offered all evening. His guest returned the smile, a faint, almost imperceptible upturn of his lips, but his eyes remained serious. "Discomfort, Jimmy," he said, "is often a precursor to growth. It's in those uncomfortable moments, when our certainties are challenged, when our assumptions are laid bare, that we have the opportunity to learn, to evolve." He leaned back slightly in his chair, the tension in his own posture easing. He had not come here to make an enemy, but to make a point, and it seemed, perhaps, that the point had been received. "This industry," he continued, his tone more reflective now, "it needs more moments of genuine connection, of authentic conversation. It needs more people who are willing to speak their truth, even when it's not easy, even when it's not popular. And it needs more people who are willing to listen, truly listen, not just for the next punchline, but for the humanity that lies beneath." He glanced towards the audience, then back at Jimmy. "Your audience, Jimmy, they're not just consumers of entertainment. They're people. They're hungry for authenticity, for meaning, for connection. Don't underestimate them. Don't underestimate their capacity to appreciate something real." The words, though spoken quietly, carried an undeniable power. They were a challenge not just to Jimmy, but to the entire machinery of the entertainment industry, a call for a more thoughtful, a more respectful, a more human approach. The silence that followed was not awkward, but filled with a sense of contemplation. The unexpected confrontation had, it seemed, evolved into something more profound, a rare moment of unscripted truth that had resonated far beyond the confines of a late-night talk show. The producers in the control room, who must have been scrambling, seemed to have made a decision to let the moment play out, recognizing, perhaps, its unique, unrepeatable power. The legend had spoken, not as an action hero, but as a man, a human being, and his words had, for a brief, illuminating moment, transformed a stage built for artifice into a space for genuine human connection. As the segment drew to an unexpected and unscripted close, Jimmy, looking more subdued and thoughtful than perhaps any viewer had ever seen him, turned to his guest. I want to thank you," he said, his voice still holding a note of genuine humility. "Not just for being here tonight, but for what you said, for making me think, for making us think." He gestured vaguely towards the silent audience, then towards the cameras. "This conversation wasn't what I expected, It wasn't what anyone expected, but I think it was important, and I, for one, will be carrying it with me for a long time. His guest acknowledged the sentiment with a slight inclination of his head. He had not sought a public apology, nor a dramatic confrontation. He had simply spoken his truth, a truth born of a lifetime of experience, of hard-won wisdom. If that truth had resonated, if it had sparked a moment of genuine reflection, then that was enough. We all have a responsibility, Jimmy, he said, his voice quiet but firm, to use whatever platform we have, whatever voice we possess, to foster understanding, to promote respect, to remind ourselves and others of our shared humanity. It's not always easy. It often requires courage, but it is, I believe, essential. He reached into his pocket, and for a moment, his fingers brushed against the crayon drawing. He didn't take it out. Its message, its innocent, heartfelt truth was for him alone. But its presence was a reminder of the simple, profound values that had guided his words tonight. The house band, sensing the shift in mood, began to play a soft, bluesy melody, a stark contrast to their usual upbeat, energetic bumpers. It was a fitting soundtrack to the unexpected depth of the preceding conversation. Jimmy, taking his cue, turned to the camera. "We've been talking to a true legend, folks," he said, his voice regaining some of its familiar warmth, but now imbued with a new, uncharacteristic sincerity. And he's given us all a lot to think about. Thank you, again, for being here, and thank you for your honesty. He extended his hand, not with his usual effusive energy, but with a quiet, respectful gesture. His guest took it, their handshake firm, a silent acknowledgement of the unexpected journey they had just shared. The applause from the audience, when it came, was different from the earlier, reflexive cheers. It was more subdued, more thoughtful, a genuine expression of respect for the man who had dared to speak an uncomfortable truth, and for the host who had, in the end, been willing to listen. As the show cut to a commercial, the bright lights dimmed slightly. He rose from the couch, his movements unhurried. He had done what he came to do, though it was not what he or anyone else had anticipated. He had spoken his truth, and in doing so, he had perhaps, just perhaps, reminded a few people that even in the most superficial of arenas, there was still room for depth, for integrity, for genuine human connection. The legend had not just entertained. He had, in his own quiet, unexpected way, illuminated. He walked off stage, the echoes of the applause and the muted strains of the band fading behind him. The usual backstage bustle seemed, for a moment, to hold its breath as he passed. Publicists and producers, who had no doubt been in a state of controlled panic during the unscripted confrontation, now looked at him with a mixture of awe and trepidation. He had broken the rules, defied the conventions, and yet, in doing so, he had created a moment of undeniable power, a moment that would likely be talked about for days, perhaps even weeks, to come. His own publicist rushed towards him, her face a mask of carefully controlled anxiety. Are you all right?" she asked, her voice a hushed whisper. He gave her a small, reassuring nod. "I'm fine, Sarah," he said. "Just spoke my mind. Sometimes it's necessary." Sarah looked like she wanted to say more, to perhaps gently admonish him for veering so dramatically off script, but something in his calm, resolute demeanor stopped her. She simply nodded, a flicker of understanding, perhaps even admiration, in her eyes. He didn't linger. He had no desire to dissect the moment, to engage in the inevitable post-mortem that would surely follow. He had said what needed to be said. The rest was up to others, to Jimmy, to the audience, to the industry, to decide what, if anything, they would take from it. As he walked down the long corridor towards the exit, he passed a group of young interns, their faces alight with a mixture of excitement and disbelief. They had clearly witnessed the on-air clash, and it had, just as clearly, made an impression. One of them, a young man with bright, eager eyes, stepped forward hesitantly. "Sir," he said, his voice filled with a youthful earnestness, that was incredible. "Thank you." He simply nodded in acknowledgement, a faint smile touching his lips. Perhaps, he thought, The next generation would be a little more inclined to value authenticity over artifice, substance over sensation. He reached the exit, the cool night air a welcome relief after the heat of the studio lights. His car was waiting, his driver standing patiently by the open door. He slid into the back seat, the familiar comfort of the worn leather a welcome embrace. As the car pulled away from the curb, he leaned back and closed his eyes for a moment. He felt a profound sense of exhaustion, not physical, but emotional. It had taken a toll, this unexpected battle of wills, this public defense of his own hard-won dignity. But beneath the exhaustion, there was also a quiet sense of peace, of rightness. He had been true to himself, to the values he held dear. And in a world that so often demanded compromise, that was no small victory. He reached into his pocket and took out the crayon drawing. He unfolded it carefully, his calloused fingers tracing the bold, uneven lines of the stick figure superhero. A small, genuine smile touched his lips. This, he thought, was true strength. This was true heroism. The innocent, unwavering belief in good, in courage, in the power of a single individual to make a difference. He had tried, in his own flawed, imperfect way, to honor that spirit tonight. And perhaps, just perhaps, his words had planted a seed, a small seed of hope, in the often barren landscape of celebrity culture. The legend had spoken, and for a brief, shining moment, the world had listened. The drive home was quiet, the city lights blurring past the window in a hypnotic stream. He didn't turn on the radio, preferring the silence, the space to process the evening's unexpected events. The confrontation with Jimmy, the raw honesty of his own words, the host's eventual, genuine apology, it all replayed in his mind, not as a victory or a defeat, but as a complex human interaction, a moment of unscripted truth in an industry built on illusion. He thought about the nature of fame, the strange, distorting lens through which the world viewed those who achieved it. He had lived with that lens for most of his adult life, had learned to navigate its demands, its expectations, its often cruel judgments. He had built walls, cultivated a persona, a shield to protect the private man from the relentless scrutiny of the public eye. But tonight, a crack had appeared in that shield, a deliberate, conscious choice to reveal something of the truth that lay beneath. It had been a risk, he knew. The industry did not often reward such candor, such vulnerability. There would be repercussions, no doubt. Whispers, criticisms, perhaps even a backlash from those who preferred their idols to remain safely on their pedestals, their narratives neatly packaged and easily digestible. But he found, to his surprise, that he didn't much care. There was a liberation in speaking one's truth, a freedom that outweighed any potential cost. He thought of his grandchildren, of the world they were inheriting. He wanted them to know that integrity mattered, that authenticity was a strength, that it was always worth fighting for one's dignity, even when it was uncomfortable, even when it meant standing alone. The crayon drawing, still resting in his lap, seemed to affirm this silent vow. As the car pulled into his driveway, he saw a light on in the kitchen. His wife, his partner through all the long, often difficult years, would be waiting up for him. She would have seen the show, would have understood, without needing any explanation, the significance of what had transpired. Hers was the one opinion, the one judgment that truly mattered to him. He got out of the car, the cool night air a welcome embrace. He looked up at the star-dusted sky, a vast, silent witness to the small dramas of human existence. He felt a sense of peace, a quiet resolution. He had faced a challenge, not on a movie set, but in the unpredictable arena of real life, and he had met it with honesty, with courage, with an unwavering commitment to his own hard-won truth. The legend had not just spoken. He had, in his own way, roared. And the echo of that roar, he hoped, would linger for a long time to come. He walked towards the house, towards the warmth and the love that awaited him. The crayon drawing clutched gently in his hand, a symbol of the simple, profound truths that truly mattered. Inside, the house was quiet, a sanctuary from the noise and glare of the world he had just left behind. His wife met him at the door, her eyes filled with a mixture of concern and a deep, unwavering understanding. She didn't speak immediately, simply took his hand, her touch a familiar comfort, a silent affirmation of her support. "Long night?" she asked softly, her gaze searching his. He managed a tired smile. "You could say that." They walked into the kitchen, the heart of their home, a place of warmth and shared memories. She poured him a glass of water, her movements calm, reassuring. "I saw the show," she said quietly, her eyes never leaving his. You were magnificent." He looked at her, surprised by the strength of her words. "Magnificent? I thought I might have overstepped." She shook her head, a small, fierce smile playing on her lips. "You spoke the truth, my love. Your truth. And you did it with dignity, with courage. In a world that so often rewards shallowness, that was a magnificent thing to behold." Her words were a balm to his weary spirit. He had not realized how much he had needed to hear them, how much her validation meant to him. He reached into his pocket and took out the crayon drawing, smoothing it out on the kitchen table. "This," he said, his voice a little unsteady, "this is what I was fighting for in a way. For the right to be seen as something more than just a caricature. For the right to have my own story, my own truth, respected." She placed her hand over his, her touch gentle but firm. "And you were, my dear. You were. You reminded everyone, including that rather startled young host, that there is a human being behind the legend, a man of substance, of integrity. And that is a lesson the world sorely needs to hear." They sat in comfortable silence for a long moment, the only sound the quiet hum of the refrigerator, the distant ticking of a grandfather clock in the hall. The turmoil of the evening began to recede, replaced by a profound sense of peace, of rightness. He had faced his own internal demons, his own weariness with the demands of his public life, and he had emerged, not unscathed, perhaps, but with his spirit intact, his integrity reaffirmed. The confrontation on the talk show had been more than just a clash of personalities. It had been a defining moment, a quiet declaration of independence from the often toxic expectations of fame. He knew, with a clarity that was both sobering and liberating, that he could no longer simply play the game. He would continue to work, to create, but he would do so on his own terms, with a renewed commitment to authenticity, to speaking his truth whatever the cost. The legend, it seemed, was finally ready to be himself, and that, he realized, was the greatest strength of all. He looked at his wife, his partner in all of life's battles, and a deep, abiding love filled him. With her by his side, he knew he could face whatever came next, with courage, with grace, and with an unwavering commitment to the simple, profound truths that defined the man he was, and the man he still aspired to be.